to develop a blue-green vision for urban flood risk management in one of our case study cities in Newcastle in the UK. So I'm going to start with introducing the project and a bit about what we're doing in general, and then discuss the Learning and Action Alliance a bit more specifically. So my name is Emily Lawson and I'm at the University of Nottingham. My role on the Blue Green Cities Research Project is to manage and coordinate the project, plus lead the demonstration case study city and do some work on understanding some of the barriers and uncertainties to flood risk management. So we've kind of realised that the issues of flood risk management don't fit into one disciplinary boundary, and so the Blue Green Cities Research Project is made up of 9 different universities with a whole range of different disciplines included, which allows us to evaluate some of the engineering and physical science aspects of flood risk management, the environmental and ecological side, and to look at some of the issues to do with the social problems that happen when we are designing flood risk management strategies. So that's our research team. And just to start with, I'm going to talk about what exactly a blue-green city is and where does this lead to the blue-green vision. So a blue-green city links with ideas such as sustainable drainage systems and water-sensitive urban design, and aims to recreate a naturally orientated water cycle in an urban environment. So this is done by adding blue and green space into the heavily grey and permeable surfaces of our typical urban environments to try and recreate that natural water cycle. So to improve infiltration, to reduce the amount of surface runoff, to have more water in designated watercourses and specific features, to add to groundwater flow and have much more evapotranspiration rather than just water being routed rapidly into the subsurface drainage system. So this is the idea of the Blue-Green City. The Blue-Green Cities Research Project is split up into multiple work packages focusing on 2 demonstration case studies in Portland and in Newcastle. And today I'm going to be talking about my work in the Communications and Uncertainty work package. So the rationale for developing and using a Learning and Action Alliance in Newcastle is that as we move from traditional grey approaches to flood risk management and try and incorporate some of the blue-green water-sensitive urban design, there may not necessarily be adequate frameworks to follow to adopt those approaches and get them implemented in city environments. There's a whole range of different barriers to the delivery of integrated urban water and flood risk management. For instance, the lack of coordination between different bodies, whether within the same organisation or between different organisations. This may be a large problem at the moment due to austerity and funding cuts, and people's roles have been streamlined, and there's often the lack of opportunity to talk to colleagues in different departments about projects that do really require an interdisciplinary approach. Similarly, changes in institutional structures and responsibilities can stop integrated water management, and issues such as too much jargon, the fragmentation of knowledge, siloed thinking can all hamper this movement to integrated water management. For instance, talking to some people in Newcastle who don't necessarily work on flood risk management as their primary job, such as those in the transportation team, for example, they may not know the detailed knowledge of the flood risk management issues, and so their lack of the technical language could be a barrier to engaging with the flood risk management professionals. Other issues such as people are just too busy. How do we actually do it? How do we deliver integrated water management once we've figured out what we want to deliver? There can also be this idea that it's not necessarily my department or my problem. It should be someone else's responsibility. So what do I need to do to get involved in this? And often there can be a lack of trust. So we've from talking to local people, we've learned that in the past there may have been some issues between different stakeholders within the city of Newcastle, and so there's this legacy of maybe project that previously didn't work so well, and there's a reluctance to do a similar project in the future. So these are some of the barriers. And from reading about learning and action alliances, because they have been pioneered in the literature, and I'll talk more about that shortly, we felt that this was a valid approach to trying to bring some of those key stakeholders within Newcastle together to try and encourage social learning and active learning. So learning and action alliances allow stakeholders to kind of experience and learn about different views on best management practices, in the case of this one, on flood risk management, and to become better informed before making decisions. So a learning and action alliance is typically an open arrangement where participants create a joint understanding of a problem and its possible solutions based on rational criticism and coherence through discussion. So discussion is the key point here. Learning and action alliances encourage its members to come to meetings and take off their institutional hat and really think about the novel solutions to problems. So those novel solutions may not be something that they would necessarily talk about in their institutional environment. It's more of a kind of open session where anything goes, really. So the more novel the solution, something that you wouldn't necessarily always talk about, that's really encouraged within the Learning and Action Alliance. And it can also encourage other people, other members who may not necessarily have thought along those lines, to maybe try and change some of their thinking. So Learning and Action Alliances facilitate the identification of innovative ideas for the solution of complex problems outside of the constraints of existing formal institutional settings. And from our experience, we found that being in an academic institution and being the ones who would organise the LAAs, we were seen as being unbiased and not pushing any particular agenda regarding surface water management and blue-green infrastructure. So for us, we were ideally placed to establish and run the Learning and Action Alliance. And the goal really is for some of the ideas and solutions that are discussed at these meetings to then be taken by the members into their own organisation and be used to inform some of the decision making. So the Learning and Action Alliance itself doesn't do any implementation of blue-green infrastructure or flood risk management. It's just the ideas and the discussions are then passed out to the different members, which we would hope would then encourage some of their thinking within their own organisations. So typically there's no fixed structure in a Learning and Action Alliance. They evolve over their lifetime, and they've got to be founded on their own specific vision that meets some of the drivers and motivations of their different members. And it's very useful to have a strong leader or a champion, or to have people within the organisations that you're targeting to support the Learning and Action Alliance approach and get their colleagues involved. The ultimate aim is to break down barriers to horizontal and vertical information sharing. And it is important to point out that although the members of the Learning and Action Alliance are very knowledgeable, sometimes because of their roles in their own organisations, they tend to contribute as individuals to the meetings. So the outputs from the meetings may not necessarily represent policy and plans of any of the organisations. So the meetings are a place for discussion and interaction between different LAA members. And we do encourage people to take off their institutional hat. So what comes out of the LAA may not necessarily be the plans for those organisations. Oh, wrong way, sorry. And the approach that we followed to set up and establish the Learning and Action Alliance was one used by the MARE project. So the MARE project was one of the EU Interreg IVB projects and stands for Managing Adaptive Responses to Changing Flood Risk. The Netherlands Living with Water project also helped pioneer the LAA approach, and through a lot of their literature that we found online, we've learned a lot about some of the pitfalls to setting up LAAs, and we've adopted some of their protocols and frameworks in setting it up. So these are good resources if you're interested in establishing a Learning and Action Alliance. For instance, in some of this work with Learning and Action Alliances in either the UK, so the Don catchment, or in Europe, Bergen, Dordrecht, Hanover. Some of the things that they found is that members often were involved in informing each other, so in a top-down approach, rather than engaging in social learning and dialogue. So the way the LAA can be set up can try and reduce this informing, because ideally it should be a discussion and this environment for engagement. So the Newcastle Learning and Action Alliance was established in 2014. Newcastle is our case study city for the Blue Green Cities project, primarily because a lot of its climate and the topographics and the socio-economic status in parts of the cities are relatively representative of other UK cities, so therefore our results could be transferable. Newcastle has had some heavy flooding events, so pluvial events in the past few years, and there is a movement towards more blue-green infrastructure. They have SUDs and blue-green design in certain places, so Newcastle was chosen as our specific site. So to start with, the LAA needs to be established, and we followed these 5 phases set out in a paper by Richard Ashley in 2012 about the Mare project. The first phase is the initiation phase, so how do you start it all off? The second phase, scoping and context, and the third one is developing this shared vision, and I'll talk through those phases in a bit more detail now. The Newcastle Learning and Action Alliance is halfway between developing the shared vision and implementation. So phase 1 is the initiation, and we initially start by forming a group of interested parties, and in the case of the Newcastle LAA, it was academics, the city council, the local water company, the environment agency, and members of local interest groups, environmental groups, and anyone who was interested in talking about novel solutions to some of the flood risk management and green infrastructure issues in Newcastle. We had a workshop at the start to introduce everyone to the project and introduce them to this new framework. And there's an opportunity for different members to give presentations, and to also identify other stakeholders who should be invited to future meetings. So this moves on to the next stage, which is the scoping and context, which is where we defined in more detail what is the reach of the Learning and Action Alliance, both politically and geographically. So we were looking at schemes within the administrative boundary of the Newcastle urban environment. And then also, again, looking at details of the stakeholders who we could invite. And we developed this stakeholder map, which highlights 4 different kinds of stakeholders that could influence or be influenced by decisions made around flood risk management in Newcastle. And so the green ones are some of the key stakeholders who often make the decisions and actually do the implementation. So the local authority, the environment agency, universities, Northumbrian Water. Also those stakeholders who have large areas of land and responsibilities for land. The orange ones are other stakeholders who again are responsible for large parcels of land and the functioning of the city. So the Highways Agency, the travel, the railways, Natural England, the Freemen of Newcastle upon Tyne, because in Newcastle there is this large green area called the Town Moor. And then other stakeholders that are maybe smaller landowners or just interested parties include professional bodies, small businesses, communities, households. After discussion with some of the Learning and Action Alliance members, we decided not to include communities and households within the Newcastle LAA. And this was a decision by some of the members that they felt that they might not necessarily be comfortable talking about novel solutions and ideas for schemes in an environment where there are members of the public who might think that what we're talking about is necessarily going to be implemented. So this was a decision by the group to only really focus on institutional stakeholders within the members. It's not to say that Learning and Action Alliance can't include the public. This was just the decision of our group. And we split membership up into 3 groups. The core group attends regular meetings, and we typically have a meeting every 2 months. and they often give presentations, and the meeting can move around and be hosted by different institutions. The wider group is generally people who are interested but can't commit to coming to every single meeting, and so can attend meetings where they're specifically interested in the topic, or participate via an online group. And all of this is held together really by the organising group, which includes the coordinator, who's responsible for day-to-day activities such as coordinating meetings and getting people to come along and do presentations and that kind of thing. And we found it was really helpful to have members, at least one member from all the key organisations within the core group, because they would help promote the LAA to their colleagues within their own environments. The third phase is developing the shared vision. And so the vision that we've discussed and negotiated with the Learning and Action Alliance in one of the early meetings centres around the idea of blue-green cities. So the vision is for Newcastle to become a city that follows the principles of blue-green design by maximising the opportunities to achieve multiple benefits of blue-green approaches to surface water management. So this is our grand vision, and the details of this vision are available on the Blue Green Cities website if you're interested. This is broken down into different steps that the Learning and Action Alliance were interested in, such as trying to do regeneration activities within the urban environment to make it a better place to live, to improve the health of some of the residents, to improve some of the wildlife within some of alongside some of the water bodies. So the vision is broken down into other subvisions. And during this phase, it was also important to establish the terms of reference. And the terms of reference really set out what the Learning and Action Alliance is all about and what some of the expectations are of being a member. So things like highlighting roles and responsibilities, protocols for data sharing and storage, and determining strategic objectives is all part of this visioning and terms of reference exercise at the start. So ultimately, the Learning and Action Alliance aims to promote the vision by realising it and utilising windows of opportunity to influence the strategies of decision makers. So the starting point is the vision, and then the next step is to try and incorporate that vision into other activities going on in the city. We have a range of strategic objectives, and here is just a few of them. To develop, promote and influence the uptake of novel ideas and blue-green strategies, to explore ways in which institutional barriers can be overcome, challenge traditional approaches, promote this broad vision through identifying specific challenges and locations of interest, and to develop location-specific strategies to inform other plans of members and beyond. So I'm just going to talk about some of the activities that we've done in the Newcastle LAA. In one of the early sessions, we started by identifying potential demonstration projects and existing blue-green and SUDS assets within Newcastle. And we separated that into 3 groups. So the first group was projects that are already delivered and that we can learn from. The second was projects that it may be possible to influence. So this is where projects are designed and are in the design phase and maybe have some funding, but they haven't been totally signed off yet. So there is kind of scope for maybe change. And the final group was visionary projects. So this is projects that don't have any funding, have never really been talked about officially, but in locations where an intervention could create a wide range of benefits. So after we'd done the kind of identification workshop, we had another workshop focusing on the Newcastle urban core. And this was kind of create a hypothetical blue-green urban core. So using local knowledge of the different LAA members and some of the documentation that exists, such as the strategic water management plans and the urban core for Newcastle, which highlights some objectives which the city is trying to reach. We took sections of the urban core on like large A0 size maps and did a mapping exercise to think about where we could put different types of blue-green infrastructure, what that would look like, how big it would be, and all based on local knowledge of the city and the hydrological systems within it. And This has kind of fed into some of the Blue-Green Cities research. So the Learning and Action Alliance has actually given us some grounding for some of our research, and we hope that it will make the research a bit more realistic as it's focused on what the actual stakeholders within the city would like. So the Learning and Action Alliance identifies certain areas of Newcastle, such as Northumberland Street, which is one of the key streets down here within the yellow box, and said that this would be an area that is of interest for regeneration, and maybe blue-green infrastructure could be included as part of that. And so the Blue-Green Cities team took that idea and then created a GIS layers of different types of blue-green infrastructure, including green roofs, street trees, and swales and permeable paving. And now we are running some flood inundation simulations to see if that does actually have an impact on flood risk management and if it does create other benefits. And so, although this is not a strategy that the Learning and Action Alliance are necessarily going to do, their ideas and their knowledge has helped the research project in that it has generated the ideas that we've used in our modelling. And this is just some of the slides that show one of the outputs for an area in Newcastle called Wingrove. So it's a dense residential area with lots of terraced housing. And so what we've done is we've turned all of the pavements to permeable paving, all the back alleyways are permeable. We've made sure that all of the green space, all of the gardens are classified as green space, and then run different flood inundation simulations to see how the addition of hypothetical blue-green infrastructure could impact on the flood risk. And we found that for small events, it does help reduce surface water. So building on the ideas from the Learning and Action Alliance, we've then modelled them within the project. The last two phases of Learning and Action Alliances in general are the implementation and capture phase. So the implementation phase, which is what we're working towards at the moment in Newcastle, is identifying and acting upon some quick wins that we've identified within the city. And one of those, which is quite timely actually in Newcastle, is that there's a lot of push towards regenerating some of the transportation routes within the city. So ideas to take out some of the dual carriageways and put in cycle lanes, adding in more pedestrian areas to make Newcastle more of a sustainable city in terms of transport. So in the last couple of weeks, some of these schemes have gone to open engagement, and there's a website you can log in and see the details of the different schemes, and there's an opportunity to leave comments. So this is a great chance for the Learning and Action Alliance to comment on some of these transportation schemes to see if blue-green infrastructure could be included in some of the design. And at our last meeting in September, we had representatives from Newcastle City Council Transport, and they talked us through these schemes, and they were really supportive of any ideas that the LAA could have. And if you know, enough people make comments and the transportation team decide it's a good idea to have some kind of blue-green infrastructure incorporated in these schemes, will be a great result for the Newcastle Learning and Action Alliance if they help that process come about. So that's the implementation phase. And there are opportunities to act on other quick wins for instance, Newcastle University on campus, they're quite interested in reducing their flood risk and adding more green space. So that is another quick win that LAA members are looking at. The final phase is the capture, and this is moving towards the end of the LAA. And there is no definitive timescale for how long they can last. So this capture phase for us may well be quite a long way into the future. But essentially it's looking at what lessons can we learn from the LAA and how can we review that and revise the vision and goals for the future. So it's a kind of a circle process as well, in that by refining the vision, you can go through some of the same processes again. And so in summary, we found that blue-green infrastructure for flood risk management requires a cooperative approach, multidisciplinary thinking, and integration between different departments within an urban environment. And Learning and Action Alliances may represent a viable way to bring those people together and start those discussions. So Learning and Action Alliances are a social learning framework and structure for collaborative working between different individuals who share an interest and who essentially are all working towards a vision, and in the case of the Newcastle LAA, the blue-green vision. And just some goals for longevity and sustainability of the LAA. So we've managed to keep it running for nearly 2 years. And we found that communication, rapport, and trust were key things to encourage people to keep coming back to meetings and invite their colleagues as well. The LAA has to have clear rewards for all stakeholders, so it has to meet some of their motivations and has to identify with some of their drivers. Active learning is a key part, so at every meeting we all learn something different about Newcastle that one of the stakeholders talks about, and you definitely need a strong coordinator to help with facilitation to make it all run smoothly. So that's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for listening. There's a lot more information on the Blue Green Cities website on LAAs, so if you're interested, please have a look there. So if there are any questions, I'll happily take those now. Thank you. I think Catherine probably wants people to type questions if there are questions. Okay, so the first question is, I was wondering what you meant by action in the Learning and Action Alliance. So this is a good point, because at the moment we've been primarily involved in the learning stage. So learning about different drivers of the stakeholders, learning about what we could do in Newcastle, learning about where there are some of these quick wins and areas that could have blue-green infrastructure. The action part is really where some of those strategies are put into place, whether it's by Learning and Action Alliance members themselves or it's through influencing some other projects. So we're kind of moving towards the action stage with some of the links with the Newcastle transportation consultations. So if the Learning and Action Alliance all write comments down for one of the transport schemes and promote blue-green infrastructure, and then that gets taken on board as a comment and potentially included in some of the schemes, that could be action from the Learning and Action Alliance group. Other actions, like I mentioned towards the end, is where blue-green schemes are incorporated into some of the typical working goals of the Learning and Action Alliance members. And yeah, I guess the key action for us and for the Newcastle LAA is if blue-green infrastructure is incorporated more widely in Newcastle. I don't think we can take the credit for all of that, but maybe we've helped move Newcastle further along. So the statement says, okay, so the action doesn't necessarily have to be undertaken by the LAA group, but is it that there should be action as a result of the work, learning, discussion undertaken? Yes, so it's kind of a bit of both. It can be action by the group if it's within their remit. So some members of the LAA don't have responsibility for flood risk management, so wouldn't be able to do anything directly themselves, but could influence their colleagues or other people. So it can be a bit of both, yes. Okay, so from Glenn, he says, how do you feel the feel or momentum of the LAA is developing? Do you think there are good enough chances that it will live beyond the project? Yeah, so this is a key goal for us in that the Blue Green Cities project finishes next year in February, and one goal of the project will be for the Learning and Action Alliance to continue beyond the lifetime of us being there. And I'm hopeful that it will, because a lot of the stakeholders there are very enthusiastic and they do attend regular meetings and they have spoken to their colleagues at various different levels about that. So I'm quite confident it will continue. Hopefully that will be helped out by our colleagues at Newcastle University, because it's always easier for the home university to attend meetings. We've kind of seen recently a bit of movement from the coordination side of the Learning and Action Alliance, from the project to the Newcastle stakeholders. So we've had a few more meetings in different institutions in Newcastle rather than just the university organising it. So yes, I'm hopeful it will live beyond Blue Green Cities, but we shall see. I think there is another question coming. You make reference to a good facilitator, strong coordinator. Who undertook the role in your experience, and did you hire anyone? Actually, so the coordinating role was split between myself and one of the Newcastle City Council members. So we didn't hire anyone specifically to do this. And for us, it was a kind of learn from practice approach. And it did take quite a lot of time to coordinate these regular meetings. And so the question, have you any advice for dealing with difficult group dynamics? That's an interesting one. We did have, because of some of the past discussions between different members of the LAA, some of the initial meetings, we weren't quite sure how it was all going to go, and whether any of those previous legacy issues would crop up. And I think by now we've kind of got over that, in that people have come to meetings regularly enough, and there is a trust starting to develop. But I guess advice for dealing with difficult group dynamics is to try and be a bit impartial, and again, it helps by being coming from an academic institution that isn't in that city. So me being in Nottingham, the different members don't feel that I'm pushing a certain approach or I'm favouring a certain, I don't know, a side of the discussion. So that definitely helped to deal with difficult group dynamics. And I guess just making sure that everyone gets the opportunity to have their say, and everyone is respectful of other people's decisions and point of views. And that can be helped by having, splitting up into small workshop sessions and then coming together as a group and just giving everyone the opportunity to have a say. The next question, how do you expect measures to work for people if local communities are not represented? Yes, that was an issue that's been discussed a few times at the Learning and Action Alliance. It's like I explained, the local communities weren't represented in this LAA, I guess on the insistence of some of the members. Quite a lot of the information that gets passed around between the groups is relatively confidential. And I think I don't necessarily agree that it was the right approach, but we went on a majority decision from the group. I don't necessarily think that, well, local communities don't always think that what's presented in discussions is actually going to happen in real life. I think we need to give a bit more credit. But again, it was a majority vote, and even though the community members weren't represented, most of the people who come to the LAA meeting live in Newcastle, so kind of have a dual role in that they do represent their own local community. And they represent their institution. Maybe in the future that will change, but that's kind of a discussion topic for the Learning and Action Alliance. Yes, and the other comment, the communities were not included. Oops, sorry. Can understand the reason. Can you tell us more about the relationship between the community and the LAA? So, as far as I know, and I might be wrong, there isn't a community flood group in Newcastle. If anyone knows of one, then please let me know. So I guess the community on the whole are not aware of the Learning and Action Alliance. We haven't really publicised it outside of the Blue Green Cities website. People are informed of meetings if they're on the membership list, and to join the LAA you have to read the terms of reference, and there is a consent form to sign to say that you're happy to be involved in these meetings, and for some of the outputs to be used in research, that kind of thing. So there isn't really an issue between the community and the LAAs, because the LAA hasn't been publicised unless people have been onto the Bloom Research's website. The membership grows really by people, by word of mouth, and people passing on invitations to colleagues. But it's an interesting point, and I think the community issue is something that we need to talk about in future meetings. Sorry, I missed a question from Amanda. Apologies. The questions move quite fast, so it's hard to keep track of where they are. So Amanda says about the practicalities. How many people became members over the 2-year period, and how often did you meet? So we meet roughly, I think we've met about 7 times each year. We try to do it every 6 to 8 weeks, but realistically, over the summer and over Christmas, you can't have meetings. What we normally do is at the end of each meeting, we discuss when we're going to do the next one, and then we'll do a doodle poll, and then the most popular date will be chosen, and the coordinator will start organising it. I think we have quite a lot of members as part of maybe the wider group as well. So I think there's probably about 50 members, and all of those members get invites, even if they haven't been for a few meetings. And typically at each meeting we have between 20 to 25 people. Sometimes if we've got external speakers coming, there'll be more people attending. But typically it's around 20-25. And again, practically, a lot of our meetings have been held in Newcastle University buildings, because one of our project team is at Newcastle Uni, which reduces the cost for hiring the venue. We do put on a lunch every meeting, so we'll start with a networking lunch, and then we'll have an afternoon session finishing at about 5 o'clock. So there is a cost for these meetings, but this was built into our project budget when we started. So the last one, have you been able to engage any developers in your learning and action lines? And that's a good question. I tried to contact some of them towards the start, but wasn't really very, very successful. Some other groups that we tried to engage with, again, because they didn't necessarily feel that they were directly involved, they didn't really want to come to a lot of the meetings. So I think something that we've learned is that we needed to identify some of the other drivers a bit more specifically before engaging with these people to get them to come to meetings. For instance, some of the transportation groups, so the rail and the roads, we've had trouble engaging with those, but I think it's partly because we didn't explain to them why they should come to the meetings. And I guess the developers, it's just been quite difficult to find a contact. That sounds a bit like an excuse, but we probably should have incorporated developers in the LAA. What we've been generally focusing on is retrofit solutions for the urban core, for example. So we haven't really done a lot of discussion at the LAA about new build development. So I think developers have kind of fell off the chart a little bit. But I think it could be a valid approach to get them on board, if you can stress the fact that it is quite an impartial, informal atmosphere, and what does get said isn't taken as this is going to be implemented in the next couple of years. If that makes sense. Yes, I think there's quite a few of the comments again are talking about building on this and including the community. And I'll take that back to the learning and action lines. We've got a meeting next week, so it'll be interesting to see what their thoughts are now that we've been through this process for a couple of years, to see how we would now go about engaging with the community, and where do you start? How do you pick? Obviously you can't invite everybody, so how do you go about doing that? So that's again a kind of a practical consideration. Finding groups such as any flood groups would be useful. We have had a bit of engagement with one of the projects within Newcastle called Greening Wingrove, which is where they do lots of sustainable gardening and green space creation in one of the sectors of Newcastle. We've had their project manager come to talk about some of the work they've been doing, but we haven't really gone from there into talking to the community members themselves. So definitely that could be a useful phase. Now that some different approaches have been identified, could the communities be involved to look at different solutions and have their views? We could definitely do that. It would just be important to say that these different solutions have been kind of mucked together by the research project, and it's not they haven't been developed by the council or the water companies, because we want to make it clear that the blue-green design that we have for the city centre, for example, is very much hypothetical, and it's not something that will be implemented. So whether people would be interested in giving their views on a design that was purely hypothetical, that would have to be discussed. But yeah, it's a good idea, and I will talk to the LAA about that. Catherine, the discussion about community involvement. In my view, it will be difficult to progress blue-green initiatives without community involvement. Yes, I completely agree. And yeah, it is difficult, but it is essential to tackle this. Yeah, and we just haven't really got there within this Learning and Action Alliance. It was kind of when we set this up, it was very much let's trial this and see if it's a valid framework for getting these institutional stakeholders involved. And the next step is to try and include some of the community members as well. It is definitely a valid point. The EA flood wardens might be a nice way to start talking to communities. Yep, so that's a good suggestion, and we can see if I can talk to some of the people in Newcastle to see if there are any community representatives who would be good places to start to get the community involved. Okay, thank you very much.